So good afternoon and welcome to our panel discussion composed of experts on the U.S. Senate who are going to discuss and answer your questions about Senate rules, procedures, norms, and how they relate to the nomination of Judge Barrett to the U.S. Supreme Court. Today's panel discussion is hosted by Demand Progress, which publishes a weekly newsletter that I think at least two of our other panelists subscribe to, called the First Branch Forecast, that focuses on building a stronger, more capable Congress. So here's how today's conversation is going to work. It'll last for about an hour. I'm going to do a very brief presentation introducing our panelists and setting the stage, at which point we'll move to a conversation on various Senate procedural questions that relate to the Supreme Court nomination, which will last 30 or 40 minutes. And after that, we'll take questions and answers from the audience. Just as a note, this conversation is being recorded and will be made available online afterward. But for folks who want to ask questions and our staff, your names will not be, unless you choose to include your name will not necessarily be visible. And since you'll be able to type in your questions, that's the way that we can see it without creating problems. And you should see on your screen, there is a little button in the middle that says the word chat. That says Q&A. I guess I can't read. There's the one that says Q&A, and that's the one where you can enter your questions for the panelists. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists. I'm going to do it briefly, but they have many more accomplishments than there's time to tell. So I'll start with Sarah. Sarah Binder is a professor of political science at George Washington University who focuses on the politics of legislative institutions. She's also a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. And I imagine in all of her copious free time, she's also an editor of the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog. She's written several excellent books, including The Struggle to Save the Federal Judiciary, which is relevant in part to today's conversation. And she has an excellent recent article, I think it was in the Post, right? That was providing an overview of the confirmation process. Yeah. So thank you.
Monkey Cage.
And Matt Glassman is a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. He formerly worked at the Congressional Research Service, where his issue areas, we had many, but included congressional operations and history. And he served on my favorite committee, which is the House Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee, which is probably the most interesting and underrated subcommittee in the entire Congress, bar none. It's even better than the Joint Committee on Printing, or, it's awesome. All right. Molly is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where she focuses on congressional rules and procedures. Her most recent book focuses on the politics of filibuster limitations in the Senate. And as we were discussing before, she supervises the publication of the amazingly useful Vital Statistics on Congress. Unfortunately, James Wallner wasn't able to join us just at the last moment, although he expressed his disappointment for what would be, in his words, an incredibly exciting and fun conversation. So I guess the last person to introduce is myself. So I'm Daniel Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress, which is a progressive institution. Our organization focuses in this context on strengthening the legislative branch. I'm the editor of the First Branch Forecast newsletter, and I've been kicking around DC for a while. And I think I was at the Congressional Research Service about 1/10 of the time that Matt was there, which seems about right. So with that, we're going to move into the Q&A and discussion portion among the panelists. I just want to set the stage very, very briefly, which is that our focus here is around Senate procedural rules and norms. We're not here to evaluate the merits or demerits of the nominee for the Supreme Court. That's not our purpose here. It's more to look at the inter-party relationships and the points of friction, or the points of where things could either be held up or places where it can be sort of smoothed out. So that's where I want to keep the conversation focused. So less political prognosticating, which is more appropriate for certain people's podcasts. And instead, we'll stay focused on sort of the substance of procedural rules and norms. So with that, Sarah, I'm going to look to you to start. Can you provide a big picture overview on the stages of consideration for a Supreme Court nomination and sort of the tentative timeline for what's likely to happen?
Sure. So first, just thanks very much for gathering us all for this Senate procedural nerd fest, as it were. So let me just preface my answer to your question with just a general observation first about Senate procedure that I always think it's important to keep in mind when we're trying to wrap our heads around the path here to a confirmation vote. And that is just this basic observation that Senate procedure is not just a set of formal rules. is like this complicated, I call it some Byzantine web of these interlocking formal Senate rules, committee rules, Senate precedents established by votes of past Senate majorities on the Senate floor, informal but often pretty durable practices, some of which sometimes we call them norms, but they're usually not written down except in CRS reports. And all that's embedded under this umbrella of advice and consent and other constitutional clauses. And of course, keep in mind, we're in the middle of an election and a global pandemic. And so with each of these institutional checks and veto points, there are different thresholds for changing them or setting them aside, which I think will be relevant when we think about how constraining are these rules. And of course, as we know from recent so-called nuclear events in the Senate, even in the Senate, it's hard for rules and precedents and practices to like protect themselves from ambitious majorities. So I just want us to keep in mind that although we can isolate particular rules and practices, they take place, and these events take place in this complicated web. And so sometimes it's hard to know exactly how things are going to play out. So in answer to your question, like what's the confirmation process look like generally? In some ways, this is, I think, this is going to sound strange, but in some ways, this is a typical process. Other ways, not so typical, but on the typical side, the basic parameters here are likely to be followed. Nomination formally made, it's been referred under Senate rules to the Judiciary Committee. There is background vetting going on, as is usual, though it seems to be quite swift, much faster than usual. We are approaching a hearing. It will mostly probably be virtual, which is not unusual for the pandemic, but unusual for a Senate confirmation hearing. At some point, there will be likely a vote on a committee recommendation, and then a series of procedural steps to get the nomination up on the floor, cut off debate, and if successful, then to an up or down vote on confirmation. So that's pretty typical. On the not so typical side, we are of course in the midst of an election with people already voting, with obviously control of the White House and Senate up for grabs, and a strong electoral incentive amongst Republicans to move swiftly before the election. And just to make clear how unusual the timing is, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg vacancy was 46 days created before the election. The nomination of Judge Barrett about 35 days before the elections, and a vote anticipated at best a week before the election. On average, since the 70s, it's taken about 70 days to confirm nominations. Judge Barrett, we're looking probably to cut that in half. And just to put the election timeline in perspective here, the next closest vacancy of a nomination before an election seems to have been Scalia's vacancy, who died 269 days before the election. So one other atypical feature here is that it seems that most minds were made up even before the president made public the name of the nominee. So on the basic outline, it looks like a confirmation process, but the closer you look, it looks quite atypical.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I mean, have we seen before? So for example, the chair of the committee came out and said that he would support whatever nominee, whoever it might be. Is that a usual public posture to be taken in advance of proceedings, or is that kind of not so usual?
I think the unusual part here is that there's no uncertainty about any senators, at least for a vote before the election. Perhaps a little bit of uncertainty on Senators Collins and Murkowski were to be bumped to a lame duck, but everybody seemed to be nailed down quite clearly, whether they were obviously on party lines for or against.
Yeah, Matt or Molly, would you guys like to weigh in as well in terms of like the typicalness or atypicalness of what's happening right now?
I mean, I think part of talking about typical is like sort of what breadth of history are you thinking about, right? We have sort of, you just go far enough back and procedures are totally different, right? You have Supreme Court nominees as recently as 80 years ago, sort of confirmed the same day they're nominated on the floor with no committee procedures at all. But certainly in the last sort of post-war era, it's a very sort of regimented process at the 30,000 foot level. And I think in part, that's why they're going through that process at the 30,000 foot level, even though, like say, most minds have been made up. There is something to sticking to the sort of norms of behavior, if only because it's not just the nominee, black or white, confirmed or not, that's at stake here, but that how people understand this process is going to affect also the external politics of the Senate and the election. And therefore, the Republicans have a strong incentive to make this seem as normal as possible, and the Democrats have a strong incentive to make this seem as abnormal as possible.
Yeah, Molly, would you like to add something to that as well?
I just agree with everything Sarah and Matt have said, and just really underline Sarah's point about the speed, and think that, and just, you know, say one of the reasons why the Senate usually, or in recent history, has consumed more time for very high profile nominations like this one is because, as Sarah mentioned, the nominee is going through a speedy vetting process, but that process can uncover information. You know, in the Kavanaugh instance, that information did not change the eventual outcome, but it certainly shaped the tenor of that debate. I think continue to shape how we talk and think about the court. And so the idea that this is going really quickly, and there may be things that we never learn or that we only learn later, is that's I think something that is unusual for modern history that's important to underline.
Thank you. I mean, I was struck by I think it was Sarah's point, you know, the average is 70 days. This is going to be, you know, if this goes as planned, it's 35 days, which is kind of interesting. I mean, this is also, is it the second post non-filibuster? I can't say the sentence right, but like this is, you know, prior to this, there would have been a greater amount of support that would have been required to get someone over the threshold. So that's also kind of unusual here. And there's also concerns in terms of members getting sick, right? We have, and correct me when I get this wrong, because I'll probably get it wrong, but three senators that we know of currently have COVID. There are 3 senators that we currently know of that are in quarantine. These are all Republican senators. There is a 4th Republican senator, Grassley, who refuses to be tested. 3 members of the Judiciary Committee are unavailable, who are all Republicans. And that kind of screwed around with the timeline. Am I wrong? Is it's 2 on the Judiciary Committee who've been exposed or have it, and it's a 3rd one, Grassley, who won't get tested, I think, unless I screwed it. And there are a lot of other people who may have been exposed to it at the weekly meeting of the Republican conference, or at the Donald Trump super spreader extravaganza, or wherever it may have been. So
I mean, I think that what I'd say, like, rather than sort of getting us tied up in exactly the numbers, that what this illustrates is one consequence of trying to move really quickly at this particular moment, that because there's uncertainty about who might be available, who might not be available, how people who maybe shouldn't be available will actually behave when push comes to shove, while also having this really fast timeline, that just expands the amount of uncertainty we have about what exactly we're talking about. And in that sense, it reminds me a little bit of in the summer of 2017, when Republicans were trying to repeal the ACA in the Senate, where there was just an unusually high level of Senate uncertainty for a chamber that has been increasingly kind of locked down and in under control of the leaders in recent years. And so when you have, in this case, kind of outside circumstances that are affecting what happens inside the chamber, that just really has the potential to, again, increase the uncertainty about how this all unfolds.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And one more thing. Sorry, Matt, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that one other thing to remember is, as you were pointing out, we are sort of in a new era, in the post-nuclear era, and you can see that affecting the process all over the place. Like, think about the Kavanaugh hearings in September of 2018. You had a nominee for the Supreme Court essentially in a yelling match with a United States senator, and that seems unthinkable in the pre-nuclear era, or at least in the recent pre-nuclear era. Likewise, senator or nominees choosing maybe to skip courtesy calls, or not have as much interaction with minority senators is another thing that just seemed unthinkable, really, just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But because of the rules changes on the floor, that gives rise to a whole new set of, I guess, non-reasons to follow certain traditional norms, and that sort of makes where we are now, really new territory in some ways.
Yeah, I think it seems almost like it's like foreshortened formalism. Like the results are known if you can get to the results, and a lot of the catch points are really come down to like who's available to actually go and meet the procedural hurdles to go through the formalist process. The one other thing that I want to talk about, sort of big picture, and then we'll start going into the committee, what happens in committee and elsewhere, is so the Senate has been unwilling to adopt any form of remote deliberation procedures in the way that the House has. So the House kind of did a half measure where they adopted proxy voting, which is not full remote deliberations, but it's kind of like half in, half out for the floor level. And in the committees, it's fully remote. But the Senate, Senator McConnell has said that it's his view, and I'm going to paraphrase him because I don't have it in front of me, that he views remote deliberations to be unconstitutional. He supports he wouldn't recognize any legislation passed in the House through this mechanism. And now we see him slip sliding a little bit. So the Senate has been using hybrid proceedings, but the people that have been physically present have still satisfied the quorum requirements. And he seems to now be edging towards maybe it means less, like maybe we can do more remotely, maybe, and we'll get into with the hearings, which requires fewer people to be physically present than the votes, of course. But it seems that like there's some sort of slippage here in terms of the institutional position. I was hoping that James would have joined us because he hates remote deliberations with a passion, whereas I'm an advocate of remote deliberations, which means that we should probably swap positions, but I guess neither of us will do so because we're too stubborn. But I'm interested a little bit, just if you guys have a take on, the Senate has been, you meet in person in committee, you meet in person on the floor. We're not going to allow remote proceedings, but now it looks like the inability to be there could actually screw up the timeline. And like, is this does this have any greater meaning than power is going to exercise power? Is there like some more substance to it than that, or is that kind of, is that kind of what it is? Sorry, it's not a great question, but what are the implications of the Senate being resistant to remote deliberations up until this point, and now starting to inch back sort of in that direction? At least that's my view. I don't know. I'd be interested in your views on that.
I think I would just add the observation that for senators and for lawmakers generally, their views about procedure tend to reflect their views about substance, about what they're trying to achieve. And I mean, sometimes it's hard to nail down exactly, are these principled positions, are these political positions? But it may be, and we may not yet know, because for all you know, McConnell will have his healthy senators back, or he'll have his infected senators back even when they're not healthy, in order to make the numbers that he needs. And thus we won't ever get that point of would he ever choose to help implement some remote voting in order to secure confirmation. And of course, we're in such a crunch time period that there's really not time to have this work out that way. But remote voting, perhaps it's maybe an exception to the, well, I don't want to say it's an exception, but it may be a procedural thing here that reflects more than the policy ambitions, or something besides the policy ambitions.
Yeah, thank you. Molly or Matt, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that a lot of when you know sort of the vote tally ahead of time, as we basically do here, a lot of the problems here become a question of how much sort of pain are you willing to take to get that vote taken. And I think McConnell would be happy to take the pain of having to bring remote voting to the Senate if it was necessary. That said, there's another level of pain, which is, are you willing to nuke rules changes or the legislative filibuster in order to get remote voting and have that vote taken? And I'm not sure they'd be willing to do that. I think they'd be much more likely to say, well, we'll kill the dress code on the floor and you can come in a moon suit if you want, or whatever.
Yeah.
But all those things matter, right? Like, as Sarah was saying, sort of short-term strategic and instrumental rules changes sort of build long-term trends in the Senate. And I assume the Democrats would probably filibuster a rules change for remote voting if that was something they thought could stop this nomination. And then you'd be like, well, what's going on here? Is this purely strategic? And yes, it probably is. So I do think there's, taking into account sort of pain thresholds for these things is really important.
Right. And Molly, did you want to add anything here?
No, I think that both, again, what Sarah and Matt said are totally on point. And so I think I'll just leave it there and we can dig into the details.
Yeah, I'd like that. I mean, I'm always interested in can you have a Senate rule against people with, fatal contagious diseases come onto the floor? Like, how does that fit in with appropriate comedy in the Senate? Or that moon suits are $250 million, so who's going to pay for it? But that's just my ledge branch appropriations hat on. So Matt, I'd like to go to you just for a little bit. So the first stage in this is we're having committee deliberations of some sort. Yeah. What's required to be in there? Like, what's required to start it? Who's required to be there? Can you talk us through that just a little bit?
Sure. So Senate committees have really wide latitude under Senate rules to hold hearings on topics as they see fit. And there's no Senate rules-based requirement judiciary even hold a hearing or even vet the nominations, like look, Merrick Garland, right? But it's also true, they don't have to do anything to vet or consider nomination that they want to move forward. Certainly in the past, we've had nominees that have been confirmed without ever going anywhere near the Senate Judiciary Committee. All the successful nominations in the last, I would think, 60 years have gone through Senate Judiciary and had a hearing. The only people who didn't have a hearing were Garland, Myers, because she was withdrawn, and then Roberts and someone in the 50s, Harlan in the 50s, who got their nomination switched. Like Roberts was withdrawn so he could be Chief Justice, and Harlan's was held over to a new session, so there's a new nomination. So everyone who's been successful has had a hearing in Senate Judiciary in certainly everyone's lifetime who's probably on this call. And a normal SCOTUS Supreme Court hearing in the modern age follows a pretty standard pattern, right? It could be relatively short, a few days, or it could be 15 days, but it generally involves a lot of opening statements from the senators and then direct questioning in many rounds to the nominee, followed by perhaps a closed session with the nominee to talk about sensitive stuff that background investigations came up with, and then sort of a public day where they bring in the ABA representative or other scholars who knew the nominee and have them talk about them and interest groups for and against the nominee. And all this sort of follows sort of Senate Judiciary's long vetting process. I mean, I'm sure people are familiar with that questionnaire they send out where they just rip apart your financial and writing life. In some ways, making sure that you're qualified, in other ways, just looking for something that might hurt you. But again, the Senate rules don't really require any of this. And the Senate rules are pretty lax on the hearing side. There's no requirement of a quorum in the hearings. The Senate rules, this is all controlled by Rule 26. And they provide for that, for the hearing purposes, committees can do what they want. Senate Judiciary doesn't have any quorum threshold. So even a single senator, the chair could just call a hearing and show up alone, and that would be totally fine to take testimony. There is a notification requirement. You need to notice a hearing 7 days out under Senate Rule 26 and also under Judiciary Rule. That's already been done. This hearing's been noticed for 4 days, October 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. So there's no issues there. The other thing Senate rules do is they prohibit the committees from meeting at certain times. So unless you get a waiver, unless you get agreement between leadership or UC or a resolution in theory, then you could be forced to not meet after 2 o'clock or after. It's still a 2-hour rule typically, people refer to it. And so that's one sort of hardball the minority can play on the Senate floor is try and stop the hearings from happening after 2 o'clock on days centering the session. And there's responses the majority can have, but that is an issue. Within a hearing, the chairman is largely in charge, power of recognition and ability to sort of judge points of order if they're even allowed, right? If you remember the Kavanaugh hearing, Grassley, the Democrats opened that hearing by really throwing a fit. Well, over an hour of really just trying to get the hearing adjourned or, make a political point. And Grassley sort of let them have their say, which I think was smart on his part, but he wasn't going to entertain anything that could seriously undermine the hearing. And so when they asked to adjourn the hearing, Blumenthal in particular was very adamant that the committee rules would allow him to make a motion to adjourn. And Grassley said, no, you're wrong. That's only for business meetings or executive session or something. And he just wouldn't entertain the motion and said, no, sorry, the chairman's in control here. And so, from the hearing point of view, if you're thinking about sort of delaying a hearing, you're probably not going to get very far. If you're thinking about making sort of a political stink and increasing the cost to the majority for doing this, it's a wonderful opportunity because you get widespread television coverage. As far as the process goes, this is going to be some of the most watched actions of the public. And so it really is a good spot for public politics to take part. But procedurally, you're not really going to be getting in the way too much of what they want to do.
Thank you. And just a quick, super short follow-up. How long, and you mentioned this, like how long do proceedings the hearings had like traditionally last? Because it looks like it's going to be 4 days in this instance, but how long is it?
Yeah, I think well, Kavanaugh came back for the second set, but Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were both roughly in this time zone. I think in recent ones, anything from like 2 days up to like 15 and drawn out. It really depends on how much they want to entertain, and then what comes up in the public, right? They never expected Kavanaugh to have a second day of hearings a week later, but typically typically I would 4 days is not like crazy short or anything. It sounds like they're going to actually do sort of a typical, lots of questions from senators. And I don't know what the median or average length is, but it's somewhere in that ballpark.
So, okay, so let's say they've finished whatever hearings they're going to do, and it sounds like there are some opportunities for Democrats to kick and scream and draw attention to it and make a political point, which they may want to do 3 weeks before the election, right? So then at some point, the chairman's going to want to move from hearings to actually having voting. And so, Sarah, this is where I want to come over to you. So what does it take for the committee to move from like having these hearings to actually voting on the nominee? And like voting is very different for report. Could you talk about like how that's very different from what the hearing proceedings are like and what's required for that to be successful?
Sure. So this is still largely, although not entirely, governed by the Senate Judiciary Committee rules. And as Matt was inferring, there's pretty broad latitude in those committees to set those rules, but there's not a lot of recourse for senators to try to enforce the rules if they think the chair is violating those rules, with one exception. So the Senate Judiciary Committee has a number of different quorum requirements depending on what exactly the business meeting is doing, but there are two in particular. One, so there are 22 members of the roster. That's set by a Senate resolution, so that's not easily changed at the moment. 12 Republicans, 10 Democrats. Majority is obviously then 12. So, and we're all discussing this, of course, in part because two of those Republican senators are currently infected and thus are currently in quarantine, plus I guess, Senator Cruz in quarantine too. So it's not obviously, right, if it were today, there's no quorum of those, of no majority of the committee present. So I think there's one quorum requirement of 9 senators, plus including 2 members of the minority party for basically discussing business. I believe there's a case in 2019 where Democrats tried to boycott, and inevitably Senator Chair Graham had a vote anyway and pushed it through and went to the Senate over their objections. So the meeting to discuss with the 2 minority party members present, that's not really enforceable by the minority party. But the critical rule here in the Senate, in the committee rule book, is the one, what does it take to actually vote or report something out to the full Senate? So, and not, this is where we sort of enter this web of rules here. So there's a Senate committee rule that's relevant, and there's a nearly identical Senate standing rule, the one that's in the rule book. So the committee rule says a majority of the committee, so 12, has to be quote unquote actually present in order to vote to report a nomination out or to make a recommendation on the nomination for the floor. So you might say, well, what happens if they do it with just 11 senators or 10 senators? Well, again, there's no recourse for the minority other than going public and expanding the scope of conflict to get everybody in the game, but there's no formal recourse for the minority to enforce that rule. But there's the relevant and nearly identical Senate rule that says when committees meet to report, that reporting, there has to be a working majority, and the word is physically present. So one might wonder, well, could they do this virtually? Is actually present? What does present mean? But physically is getting a little harder to do it by Zoom. So there is this working assumption under the rules that you're going to have a majority present, and that I think is the potential stumbling block here, and why we hear these reports of, well, perhaps the Judiciary Committee will do it in the Senate chamber with the infected senators, with or without the moon suits in the galleries. Understanding that the galleries were used in a House vote earlier on in the pandemic, on the floor vote, just to spread everybody out.
I want to follow up on just a couple of those things quickly. So I want to talk about recourse for these problems. So when I was researching continuity of Congress, one of the big questions is what happens if you don't follow your own rules? And there's a Supreme Court case on this. There's actually two, one from like the 1880s or 1890s, and God knows I don't remember the name anymore. But basically, and then there's one from the 1940s having to do with contempt proceedings. And the court overturned the determination of the committee in the House to hold a person in contempt because they didn't follow their own rules. And I wonder, like, if the Senate Judiciary Committee doesn't follow its own rules or doesn't follow the Senate rules, is there a recourse outside the chamber in the way that there had been previously?
Well, technically, there's a recourse inside the chamber, which is when if the Judiciary Committee goes forward even without a majority physically present, conceptually, when Mitch McConnell brings the Senate into executive session and calls up the nomination, in theory, and this is where we need to pipe in James Wallner, Democrat could get recognized to offer a point of order that, in essence, a standing rule of the committee has been violated. And if you go look up the precedents on what happens if you violate that committee quorum rule, raise a point of order against the nomination gets sent back to committee.
Yeah.
So then we do then enter this realm of whether there would be a majority that could reinterpret the rule for Supreme Court nominations coming from the committee, given that the Senate majority has already said you just need a majority to cut off debate. So you could imagine the point of order being made. You could imagine the parliamentarian whispering to the, I have to whisper, but they do whisper. Can you whisper on Zoom? You whisper to the presiding officer saying, yeah, they violated it. And so I advise you to uphold the point of order. If the presiding officer upholds a point of order, then surely a Republican would try to overturn it. And the question then is there a majority vote to basically void, in this case, the Senate rule? And then we're back into our numbers game.
Yeah, and that's going nuclear, right? Like that's using.
Yeah,
it's another, like, we seem to be going nuclear war all over the place, but this is another example of where you would have 51 people if they're present, and you have two Republicans who have indicated they don't want to go forward with this proceeding, so they would also be in play in theory, right? But it becomes like really uncertain as to whether they can get 51 to go forward.
Or a simple majority to set a new precedent. And so I think it's an interesting academic, question about whether Collins and Murkowski, who said they don't want to vote, would they prevent the majority from putting the nomination up to get it basically the business of the Senate?
And this would also eat up time too, right? Like the other issue is that there is a time limitation to go forward, and that this could also push things closer to the election or potentially pass it, depending on like how much drama comes from all this. Is that fair to say, or not? Not really.
Yeah, we're in the days. I mean, the Senate never moves terribly fast, but
yeah.
The other thing I would add is that if what we're talking about is if we're entertaining scenarios where the Senate, where McConnell has enough senators to say use what Sarah sometimes calls a targeted nuke or a mini nuke on a particular provision to make this happen. There's also the option so that there's a process by which the Senate can discharge committees of nominations. In the set of procedural steps to do that, there is a debatable nomination that is still subject to 60. But if we're in this world where we think that there are 50 senators who are sufficiently committed to doing this, that is another, and they're willing to invoke the nuclear option in a targeted way to make it happen. That is another way that they could get the nomination out of the committee and onto the floor.
And this goes, I think, thank you for that, Matt. And this goes back to what Matt's point was, I think, which was you can probably do this but you can really you can make this look really irregular, right? Like if you're nuking rules left and right, if you're pushing things out of committee or pulling things out of committee, like if there's a spectrum of like, this is a typical proceeding and this is really weird, like we start moving more and more towards like, this is really weird and people are gonna, like, it's not gonna look like a typical Supreme Court confirmation if you're getting rid of rules or nuking rules or changing interpretations of rules. Does that seem like a fair assessment? Or I don't want to.
I mean, the question then becomes sort of, at least to me, to whom is it important that it's become on your spectrum on the weird end? And
Yeah.
This gets back to Sarah's earlier point about how, when senators talk about procedure, they're really talking about underlying policy, or in this case, an underlying nominee to the Supreme Court who will effectuate policy in that position. And so if that's what you care about and you have sufficient unity in your conference to make it happen, there are, as we've just laid out, a couple of different procedural avenues to get over the hurdle that is created by this current math problem that Republicans might have.
So I have two more sort of targeted questions. I'll get to you, Matt, in 1 second, but I had one more question for Sarah, if that's all right. So for business proceedings, you need to have at least 7 Republicans and at least 2 Democrats. So what happened? I'm misstating it. Would you say it the right way? Because I'm going to say it wrong.
Sure, even better. I'm going to put it right in front of me here because I don't like to go from memory here. Okay, quorum. 7 members of the committee actually present for the quorum for discuss business. Okay, so we're beyond discussing. 9 members of the committee, including at least 2 members of the minority, shall constitute a quorum for the purpose of transacting business.
Right.
The business we have in mind here is covered by the next clause. No bill, matter, or nomination, ding, 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 shall be ordered, reported from committee, however, unless the majority of the committee is actually present at the time, blah, 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 blah.
So with that, sorry, I didn't mean to catch you like in
No.
So let's say so you need a majority of the committee. So it's 22, so you need 12. So you've got 10 Republicans and 1 Democrat. You've got 1 Democrat there to object. And you can say, I'm objecting because there's only 1 Democrat and you need 2 Democrats. Is that enough? Like the issue that you said that there isn't recourse to enforce that. Can you just expand on that just a little bit more?
So that's just my impression from watching what has gone on in the Judiciary Committee under Graham from that 2019 case. And that is, and I think there are a couple more complications. There have been some delays. There was the end of the day here, though, Democrats, I believe, had not shown up for varying reasons. And when Graham did meet to go ahead and do with it in the aftermath, Democrats protested kind of vociferously. We have, the ranking member Leahy, I guess it wasn't ranking anymore, but ripping up the rule book on C-SPAN for us. But that, again, because that falls under the committee rules, but is not indicated in the Senate rules, it's just a different level of enforceability, as best I understand the enforcement power of those.
How is that enforced? Like, is there an enforcement mechanism? Is it you complain to the full chamber, presumably, or you tell me?
Which the
So,
committee?
So let's say, God forbid, I'm a Democratic senator right now on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Like, and the role's gotten even worse than it currently is like 5 minutes ago. So I'm on there. I'm the only one who shows up. I object. What procedural options, if any, are available to me to make it stick?
Well, I think you'll frequently hear minority parties sort of raising objections, but the chair overrules them. It's just that as best I think of these committee proceedings, it's just much less institutionalized, meaning these rules are not entrenched in the way that they are in the Senate rules. And probably that's a good question why, but they're not, and it serves the majority's purpose when they have a concerted majority ready to move.
And it also seems like there might be, you can have your cake and eat it too moment where 1 Democrat could be there in person all the other Democrats could be virtual. Being virtual doesn't count as being in person because you're not in person. Thus, you're not in person. Like, it's this crazy circular argument. And therefore, you can participate and scream and shout, but you're also not, I mean, whatever. This is, you know, this is where going weird goes pro, right? Like, this is that kind of moment. So James was going to talk about the floor stuff, and James isn't here to talk about the floor stuff. So I'm hesitant to get into it too much, and I also know that there's questions that are waiting. I just wanted to ask one or two questions about the floor, and I don't know if you guys are able to address it, but there's two different calendars. Well, more than two calendars, but there's the executive nomination, the executive calendar, and then there are other calendars. How do you, like, so judiciary committees reported out the nomination either with problems or without. How does it get taken up? And like, how do you switch? You know, because McConnell right now currently has scheduled like other nominations, or maybe they're going to do the airline relief bill or whatever it is that they're going to, like, how do you go from one to the other? And like, is it possible to pop them out of being in, you know, confirmation mode to go and deal with the War Powers Resolution or a Congressional Review Act measure or something else that might be privileged? Like, is there a way that you can undermine, or like the Democrats can undermine or affect these proceedings as he's either McConnell's trying to go to the proceedings or get him back out of those proceedings? I'm looking for anyone who might know.
Just on going in,
Yeah.
McConnell gets recognized first by precedent. He can make a single, non-debatable, meaning no filibuster motion to both go into executive session and to pluck off that nomination and make it the pending business in executive session. And just to put our nuking in perspective, it didn't used to be that way until Bob Byrd, as assistant majority leader or majority leader, nuked those two procedures, right? You could never filibuster going into executive session, but you could filibuster getting that nomination off the floor. And that was nuked in the late 70s. So again, under the guise of making the nominations process work. That lets them in. I'll defer to Matt and Molly. I mean, usually when they want to get out quickly, there's often unanimous consent to make those moves quickly. Obviously, he may or may not be able to get that, although my guess is once they go in, they want to.
Yeah, it seems UC might be less likely these days. But Matt or Molly, did you guys want to jump in? Oh, Matt, you're on mute if you do. Sorry. You were so excited.
I just want to go back to one thing about the committee procedures as they interact with the floor. One thing in Rule 26 is that once it's reported out under those rules, then you can't raise points of order about things that went on internally in the committee on the floor. So if they follow the reporting requirements and it reports out, then the Senate has taken the position that they're not going to entertain concerns about what went on in the committee. And I think that's what ultimately blocks you from dealing with committee procedure on the floor internally to the committee. You have to report it out under the Senate rules correctly. But once you do that, a majority of the people vote for it, physically present there, then you're going to be stuck trying to go and claw back into what happened in the committee in the business meetings as a point of order on the floor. So, the thing I was going to say about the going back and forth between the calendars that I think is important at this point in the Senate is that the executive calendar and executive session in the Senate has really become a majoritarian place at this point, whereas legislative session in the Senate is still very much a place where the filibuster is really relevant. And I think this matters because I think the senators in the majority are much more willing to nuke other things in executive session. And so, for instance, the debate over discharging the committee if you had to, I don't think any senator is going to hesitate to nuke that rule that the discharge resolution is debatable in executive session anymore, because I think they've come to see nominations as a place where it is majoritarian in the Senate floor. And so if there ever was any problem in committee, I think from a public perception point of view, the hearings are huge because not having them would look really weird in public. Whether you have a public vote to report it out in committee, that is covered on TV and nominations, and it is somewhat important. I don't think it's as important as the wall-to-wall hearings. But ultimately, I think they would be very willing to take a nuclear action in executive session, whereas I think if you could force them into a box where they had to take a nuclear action in legislative session, I think you'd be in a completely different situation.
So I'm working my way through questions from folks. Thank you, Matt, for that. One of the questions, and I think it connects, so we're talking about, violation. We were talking about violations before, but let's go back to violations. So let's say the committee wants to change its rules or to suspend its rules. Is that a viable option at this point? Is that something that they would be able to do in advance of all the proceedings? So you don't need to have 2 Democrats, you can have none, or so that you don't have the specter of the chairman ignoring the rules, but rather the rules have changed and thus there isn't a problem. Is that something that's what is that? Is that possible? Could Senate Judiciary meet on Monday and change their rules? Well, I guess they could, but would they be able to do so given the current political circumstances? Does anybody want to?
Well, they'd run into the same problem you're describing, is that it would be a business meeting with votes of the committee, and they wouldn't, in theory, be able to do a rules change without having the quorum there that includes minority members. And so, could they do it? Sure.
Yeah.
Would that create a
same problem, right?
Some sort of storm? Yeah, it's sort of taking on the very problem you're trying to solve with the rules change, because it's sort of built in recursively into the same question.
So in those circumstances, I'm afraid you're probably about to hear my kids running through the background. I apologize, everyone. If the Democrats were playing defensive, if they were to think that such a measure were likely to come up on Monday, then the wisest thing for them to do would be to only have one person there in person, everybody else be virtual or something like that. That would be a reason. That would then prevent the change in rules from being done with appropriate Democratic presence to actually be able to do so. Is that right? Am I getting too up in the details here?
It would allow you to object in the committee and not allow the change to happen by unanimous consent or voice vote. That would hide the fact that there weren't 2 minority members there. But beyond that, I don't, it's the same sort of problem as trying to block the reporting vote on the same way.
Okay, thank you. So, and I'm trying to do both at the same time, so I'm not doing it well. There is a question, Matt, I think that came up for you, although it's a free ball for Una, which is that, is the Senate in session next week for the purpose of the 2-hour rule? Can committees meet when they're not in formal session without getting unanimous consent?
The Senate's in pro forma session next week, so that when they're actually in session next week, they'll be in session for mere minutes on the Senate floor. And the committees don't need particular leave beyond that. There's no sort of consent that's going to be needed on the 12th to have these hearings from the floor, because the floor won't be in session.
I think reading into it, and I could be, you guys know more about Senate rules than I do, but I think the question was more on lines of, if the committee's going to meet beyond a certain point, in theory you could object to, I think it's 2 o'clock, you could object to the committee meeting because it interferes with Senate proceedings. But since Senate proceedings are pro forma and very fast, they probably won't bump up against where that would be something that would be a live circumstance. So that's how I'm interpreting what that question was pointed at. But I'm kind of reading into it. So we addressed latitude that Republicans on the Judiciary Committee have to change their rules. I'm just seeing if there's so while I look here for a different one. The question that I have is, so you've got, Senator Typhoid Mary who wants to go to the floor, right? You have a member who is ill with a lethal disease. Can you, is that something that is permitted? Can you stop a member from coming to the chamber if the nature of their circumstances is such that it endangers life and limb to the other members? Is that a rule or a norm or a process, or is that just good common sense? I'm open to are there restrictions on members who could cause great harm to other members from actually showing up physically? You're all staring at me.
So I'll put this in the category of things that it's kind of insane that we're contemplating, which is, and you sort of laid out the idea, you know, you, in phrasing the question, you said we talked about a rule or a norm or good common sense, and I think that the Senate, rightly or wrongly, has long prided itself on being a norms-based institution, and we can argue about the degree to which that is actually true. You know, what do we mean when we talk about norms and so on and so forth? But I think that, and this goes back to something that Matt was saying before about the Kavanaugh hearing and the idea that 10 years ago, a Supreme Court nomination hearing devolving into a shouting match between a U.S. senator and the nominee would be unheard of. I feel sort of the same way about this question, which is, you know, in any other set of circumstances, why would, if it was the case that Republicans or the majority party could not constitute the necessary number of votes to get something done because one of their members has a lethal contagious disease, like, we would wait and do it later. And so that's not really an answer to your question. It's just to say that it's a reflection on the question itself.
Yeah. So let me do it this way. So same question, but different variation. Wearing a moon suit strikes me as not being a suit or a skirt, right? Like, I mean, there have been at times limitations in what constitutes appropriate attire that one can wear, and one would imagine that something out of ET is probably not viewed as generally acceptable on the floor. Are there any norms or rules or limitations as to what you can wear on the floor, such that, you know, Senator Johnson's moon suit might be inappropriate for reasons other than the fact that, like, it's not effective at preventing people from possibly catching COVID? Like, does it violate those norms?
So,
I mean, I know this is crazy, guys, but like, this is where we are. So Sarah and then Matt.
I was just going to say there is a standard of conduct for and decorum rules. So, but obviously they don't cover moon suits. But the question is whether one could read standards of conduct to provide a basis for a Democrat to challenge on the floor. I think I'm sort of in Molly's camp here, but also just to keep in mind that if it's coming down to things like this, part of it depends on the Democrats' willingness to make it their strategy, and then it's still not quite clear to me what the Democrats' strategy is and whether they are hankering to push this as best they can to vote into the lame duck, or whether they're trying to use it as a messaging for this particular election to raise the stakes. Yeah. And so that's in part why when we go down these questions, which obviously are relevant because Senator Johnson says I'm putting on a moon suit, but it's just a little difficult to know who has incentive to pursue them in what way.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I'm asking more unusual questions, I guess, is, I mean, the circumstances are really odd. And because this is being done right before the election, it seems like, from just where I sit, that the stakes are heightened for all the parties. Like, the Republicans have every incentive to move this forward for a number of reasons, including possible electoral results in states that are being voted on that may change their composition. And the Democrats have every incentive to do so, to fight, to try to push it after the election if they can. And certainly to show that they're fighting if they're not, because it fits the other aspects of their agenda. Like, both sides seem to have a great incentive to go all the way down the line and to show, you know, for Democrats at least, like, how unusual these proceedings are, and for Republicans, how far they're willing to go to confirm someone to the court. So it seems that, like, there's a real willingness on both sides to go really far down this line, which is why normally I would feel ridiculous asking you guys questions about moon suits, which, by the way, are not designed to protect other people from getting COVID, and they cost $250 million. And, like, there's a whole series of things that make it kind of ridiculous. But yeah, I'm forced to ask these questions nonetheless, just because, I mean, it's actually being seriously reported. One question that had come up on the side, because that's where I'm looking at the Q&A. was about the ability to delay Senate proceedings for a week in the committee. And that's not something that we had talked about. Is there someone who could just talk about that briefly and explain like what that is and how that works? And yeah, I think the question actually specifically addressed it to Matt, but I think all of you could probably answer. So is there someone who could address the 7-day delay?
Sure. I mean, that's in the Judiciary Committee rules as well. And it's not unusual, particularly in considering nominations for the minority party, a member to make it or a majority, and for the chair to accommodate it. Whether or not, and it may be that they've baked in an extra week here in order so that understanding that the minority member is going to make it. But if there's, tag team, I think at some point Graham would stop again. The strength of the committee rule here, hard to enforce.
Yeah.
So again, it's the status of a committee rule. I think it's kind of tough for the little recourse, formal recourse for a member to try to get the chair to observe it.
So let me ask one more question sort of along these lines, but this one is it's a little different and there's two sides of it. So I'll ask both sides and you guys can feel to respond as you think appropriate. So one of the questions from folks watching is, could a committee, for example, bar sick, say, I'm sorry, you're sick, you're going to kill us. You're not allowed to, so Democrats could offer during the business session, they could say, I'm offering a new rule for the committee that says that if you've got COVID, you can't be here. Or here's the obverse of that. Senator McConnell finds that he's got 49 on the floor, right? He's got 49 votes. And the Democrat, or 48 votes, let's make it easier, 48 votes and one Democrat who's there to object. Can you use the sergeant at arms to compel people to be there? Can the Democrats, if there are 46 Republicans and 47 Democrats, can Democrats use the sergeant at arms to compel people to be there until that they have a functional, is that something that is also at play? So I realize these are two compound, so let's start with the first one, which is, and the rule, and I assume the answer is probably you can do anything if you can get a majority, right? But in the committee, the only Democrat there, or a bunch of Democrats decide to surprise and show up and say, we're going to make a rule that bars sick members from participating in committee, which of course there is no right for a member to participate in committee in the same way that there is on the floor. Is that something that would that be workable? What does that look like?
Not in practice. I mean, in practice, you'll just be beaten procedurally, right? I mean, even in a live business meeting, if it came down to brass tacks, they'd make a non-debatable tabling motion, get rid of your thing and move on. But they wouldn't even have to do that. I mean, I don't think it would come to that. I do think more generally, sort of like the moon suit issue is sort of one that won't come up because it's just not practical for the Democrats to even try something like that. Johnson could literally just stick his head out the cloakroom door and hold his thumb up, and then it's over. He's voted and he's gone before you'd have any chance of trying to do anything procedurally about it.
Yeah. Well, you could bar them from the campus, though, right? You could say no one who has a lethal disease that is communicable is allowed on Capitol Hill, right? Or who knows if they
on the Senate side of the Capitol, then you'd need, sure. But to do that, you'd need a resolution that you're never going to get. Even if you had a majority, you couldn't get that resolution. But I think more generally, there is this question of what level are you willing to take the dilatory tactics? We talk about hardball a lot, but there is real hardball that is not being played, which is object to every UC, call for a quorum call every time you don't have a majority on the floor. And those things are all sort of, if you have to run out the clock for 35 hours, all sorts of stuff comes into play. I don't know how practical it is when you have to go for weeks and weeks. And you become sort of the ire of public perception, because once you start doing that stuff, now you're holding up the COVID relief bill.
Except there is no COVID relief bill.
Right, but I mean, in theory, right, you're not just freezing down the nomination; you're freezing down the United States. I mean, there is
if you freeze the United States Senate into December, then we're not talking about COVID relief bill. We're talking about shutting down the government.
Sure.
Right.
Excuse me, Daniel. To Matt's point about a complicating factor in this particular situation about the kind of hardball that Matt is describing is also that it requires people to physically be in proximity to each other at a moment when that is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So we could that complicates the story and kind of how we should think about the possibilities here.
Thank you. And Molly, I want to apologize. I didn't mean to talk over you just a moment ago. But to both of your points, this may not be sustainable for months, but we're talking a couple of weeks until the election. That seems like, I don't want to get into pundit land, but like, it seems like a few weeks, you don't even, if you delay things a week in the Senate, that might be enough to sort of push things past the election timeframe. And that might be a different incentive for the Democrats than to try to push it to to after the inauguration. So I think we're all talking about the James Walnerian school of like Senate politics, right? It's like, how much are you willing to fight and how much do you want to be seen as being willing to fight? And that is what's driving whether Schumer or McConnell are going to go and use more tactics to go and try to prevail to the day, right? Is that a fair, I'm trying to be neutral, is that like a fair summary?
Conditional on McConnell and or Schumer needing the whole conference or caucus behind him in order to pull it off. And especially in 3 weeks to an election, they're competing electoral and other incentives that even his own members have, let alone potentially conflicting goals of the minority leader.
Yeah.
It's just, again, it's hard we can outline all these steps conceptually that might happen, but senators have to be the ones to stick together to take them and to back each other up. And it's not clear that Democrats are as single-minded focused on blocking a vote as many people think they should be, which gives rise to this, like, why aren't they doing X and why aren't they doing Y, and what are they going to do in these different situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think what James would say if he were here is that if the Democrats really just forced quorum calls and live quorums and forced 51 Republicans to be on the floor from now until the election, the Republicans might melt pretty quickly and start thinking of trying to cut deals. Because I don't think, I think that would be very painful for the Republicans. Not that they wouldn't have potential weapons to, back out of it, particularly sort of public comments about what the Democrats are doing. But I do think that everyone, majority and minority, whether you're trying to sort of enforce sort of unusual majoritarianism or dilatory tactics that are new, has to deal with the fact that like public perception and other goals are implicated by them. And as much as this nomination seems like the whole world to a lot of people, it's only a piece of the short-term world and the long-term world for any of these individual actors or the collective actors as parties. And so I think they are very skeptical of doing things that would appear to hurt other goals they have, and they have to be judicious with how they employ these tactics. Because I mean, I think you're right. If you could get recognized as a minority member in open session, right, in general session, and get your own, thing going on the floor, and then just literally stand there for 15 days, you could force them to blow up the legislative filibuster. You can't stand there for 15 days. You will fall over. And at some point, it all comes back to sort of, well, then what are you going to do? How much are you willing to do to force sort of action that the other side doesn't want to take?
And I think that is the best summary of our conversation for the hour, which is, how much are you willing to do? The three of you have been incredibly generous with your time, particularly on such a short basis. You're so knowledgeable about the Senate. It is always fun talking with you. I don't get to see you often enough either, so thank you for letting us have what's as closest to an in-person conversation as we can have. I can tell by the questions that came in that people really enjoyed the conversation. I encourage everybody out there who didn't get their question answered. Well, I was gonna say you could at the folks, but that's probably not fair. You can at me, so like it's less offensive to them, and then they can watch my crazy Twitter account anyway. But thank you all. We'll put up the video just as soon as Zoom finishes processing it. I'd like to thank Sarah, Molly, and Matt. This has been incredibly helpful, really insightful, very thoughtful, and just as timely as it could be. I may impose upon you again to come back and talk about these things in the future as we enter the brave new world. But for now, I just hope that you please stay safe and take care of yourselves and keep telling me good things about the Senate. So thank you so much. Be well. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.